This is Karl-James Langford. This is the archaeology of our landscape. I've been looking with my students over the past few months individual areas of the landscape across our wonderful land of Britain. And today we're going to be looking at 3 areas of military archaeology and a bit more of a tribute, really. Tribute to people who suffered the grisly effects of the First World War. And there's no guesses what this image is showing from that First World War between 1914 and 1918. It's the First World War where we'll go today, but then we'll follow it by looking at pillboxes across the landscape from the Second World War, and a little aperitif at the end looking at aerial photography. Without further ado, let's look at this. What could this be part of? This is actually from a trench system, not in the land of France or Belgium, but this is part of a trench system in Cumbria. We take our first look at Penally, Pembrokeshire, and at Penally what we find is a system of trenches that were established at a number of intervals along the Welsh coast, along the Cumbrian coast, Northumberland, parts of Scotland and England elsewhere. Practice trenches in the First World War were seen to be essential to train our conscript troops. And they were conscript troops not just from our land but across the Commonwealth, and later in 1917 being joined by the Americans themselves. The idea of trench warfare was relatively new. They thought the war was going to be over by Christmas, and then the idea of trench warfare had definitely set in. There were practice training trenches established, as we've already said, across our land. Manuals and guidelines of the day set these out. But gradually by 1916, the true realities of the trenches had to be set out in a new and fresh approach based actually on the trenches of the First World War. Very interesting to think that the First World War is borne out in reality and with actual models to train the troops in the safety of the land of Britain. But alas, the trenches that were established across our land saw their own victims themselves. Individuals were killed and maimed from bomb blasts. The trenches themselves in our land were places where live ammunition was used. Fatalities are definitely there in the graveyards across our land, and obviously they were using live shells from artillery positions. The Penally system itself demonstrates the great tragedy of training our troops, getting them ready for the trenches, and actually getting them too ready, where they were already shell-shocked and battle-worn before they ever reached the trenches of Flanders. The trenches that you can actually see at Penally, lots of them are constructed dug directly into the sands and the muds. But Penally also sees that the troops are actually trained digging directly into the solid rock as well. It's an archaeologist's nightmare, as you can see from this illustration. An archaeologist's nightmare in the sense that try to understand this from the landscape rather than above. Now, lots of trenches across our land can be seen even at places like Bodelwyddan in the likes of Denbighshire and North Wales. This image itself, which you can actually see, which will be static at, is a landscape that is marked by the very artillery shells that were ranged at the troops in these trenches, practice trenches at Bodelwyddan Castle. You can see the whole arrangements of trenches there, and you can think that initially there would be 3 trenches set up to practice the troops, 2 forward trenches and a reserve trench, with a whole lane of trenches connecting them, communication trenches and supply and so on. But eventually that they worked out that they needed a new form of trench system directly based on those in France. In fact, there were whole networks of trenches set up across our land that directly mirrored those in France and Belgium. And sawtooth plan trenches, as you can actually see in this illustration, are there to prevent the shell and bomb blast travelling along the trenches, and meaning that if you captured as an enemy one section of this trench, you would only contain yourself in 10 meters. The rest of it would be openly defended by those individuals that were defending the trench. Back to Bodelwyddan itself. Bodelwyddan in 1915, you've got an extensive landscape of practice trenches and shell holes. 1915 was the time that Kinmel Park Camp was established, with thousands of fresh conscripts there to be trained. We had a discussion about this in my class. What if the conscripts couldn't cope with being shell-shocked? Would they have still been forced to go to the trenches? The answer is some of them would have been, and dire consequences for them. Others would have been given other jobs so they could cope with the very life in the army. There are 150 acres of land here that were handed over in 1915 to the British Army and other troops being trained. Sections of it were preserved after the First World War because the girls' school, Lowther College, was established there, and the headmistress was a keen golfer, establishing a 9-hole golf course across the landscape. The bits that do survive are what we do see are the only sections that survive of trenches, really, because when you go to somewhere like France, lots of the trenches were filled in immediately after the First World War. The French and the Belgian people wished to forget, and so did the Germans as well. And lots of the trench systems of the First World War in France were never recorded because they haste to backfill them to hand back over to agriculture. And so too were many examples of the trenches that were established in our land. Lots of them weren't recorded. Troops sent directly to the front, Official Secrets Act signed, and some of these trenches are being refound, rediscovered, only less than 100 years after being forgotten about with the terrible events of the First World War. And the great tragedy is, as we move on to this section of trench that can be seen in Cumbria, excavations and survey of First World War practice trenches at Walney Island, South Cumbria, overlooked by Baron Furness, have been recently excavated by the prehistorian, but he's also into various different areas of archaeology, Dr. George Nash. Now, Dr. George Nash was funded to do the work at Walney Island in the vicinity of large changes in the First and Second World War. The whole landscape was pockmarked with the enigma of the First World War. In many ways, the military history of Walney Island is still very much an enigma, according to Dr. Nash. Researchers are faced with limited documentary evidence. All the survey map embargoes between 1916 and 1985, and little in the way of surviving above ground archaeology. But it's when we look at the archaeology itself, giving you the great secrets of the First World War. Think about these two very questions. The soldiers were being trained, and lots of their ephemera was left behind in the trenches, giving you a moment in time. Soldiers trained over a long period of time from different regiments. Troops from the Loyal Lancs serving in Penally, troops from the Welsh regiment serving in Cumbria. One terrible thing to say is that you may have been a conscript, being offered a place in a regiment, and then you're put into your basic training. You go over the edge of these trenches, and suddenly you're hit by a live round. It kills you. What does the army do with your body? They can't send your body back home to your community and say, actually, your boy, your husband never went to France. They were killed in a practice range in this country. So it's likely that the body was put into the coffin, sent back to the village or town, and then it would have been explained that we managed to recover the body of your loved one. We brought it all the way back over from Ypres, Passchendaele. At least you've got your son back, your husband back, your uncle back, your loved one back. The tragedy is that many bodies were never brought back from France or Belgium. And the tragedy is that your dear loved one never ever saw action, never ever served for their country. But this had to be covered up, because could you imagine the outcry if your sons of the country had been killed just down the road, being practiced to train in the tragedies and the horrific nature of the First World War. Walney Island itself is the area where we've been excavating as archaeologists. It's a wonderful snapshot to understand the array of artefacts, military activity, .303 bullet heads, occasional shell cases, and even a little bit of an enigma, a British soldier dropping a coin in 1915 dated to 1840. Coins back then were in circulation for a very long time, but it's our personal effect. After the closing of the excavations by George Nash, Dr. George Nash at Walney Island, when the excavations were concluded in 2014, out comes a local resident known as Andrew Bolton, showed the team several photographs of his grandfather, Private Hugh Thomas of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, 43894. Mr. Thomas was one of many soldiers to use the practice trenches on North Walney between July 1916 and January 1917, prior to being sent to the dreaded Western Front to fight at Passchendaele in the Third Battle of Ypres that year. It's no game discussing these trenches. It's no fun story. It's a tragedy in itself that we wish to forget. But to forget is to ignore history. We must understand that this backyard of our history is important. George Nash, about his Walney Island excavations, comments, "This is probably the closest we can get to the horrors of early modern warfare, based on the limited finds and artefacts shown to the team. The practice trenches on North Walney were a busy place with conscript and professional soldiers learning how to use shallow trenching, especially prior to 1916, when battlefield tactics began to change forever, with trench warfare becoming a 3-year stalemate along the Western Front." Moving on, and as one of my video logs, I haven't actually got as upset as I'm doing this one. And the soldiers being trained for the First World War were being trained in remote places in Scotland. This is Ross-shire, Scotland. You can see the tough edge system there, where the conscripts were being put through their paces in a very desolate landscape, treeless landscape. that can be Ypres, Passchendaele, Mametz Wood, Verdun. This landscape itself is what they would have been up to. Very cold, boggy landscape, being forced to dig these trenches even before they got to France, wishing to get them battle hardened. You can see the occasional crater holes, as we did see the image of Bodelwedden. This again showing you some crater holes, the trench network, and some unusual designs in trench warfare there. This example itself is from Otterburn in Northumberland, part of the Northumberland desert landscape. And this is at Birch. This is a Birch Newton trench in the woods. Look at it. It could almost be yesterday, while our great grandfathers were fighting and practicing for the conflict that is the disaster of the First World War. There was nothing great about this war at all. Off my dear soapbox now. It's I wanted to add one other thing about. I should have just done a video on these First World War trenches actually, but as I'm in the thick of it now, just mentioning this. I don't have an image, but very recently, trenches were found after a company working for the Coal Authority performed an aerial survey to find old mine workings in Buxton. Found, discovered, rediscovered. Nobody knew, everyone wished to forget that this practice trench system was actually ever there. The Coal Authority carried out the survey, and the rush to train these soldiers meant their officials did not get around to recording the trenches. Simon Crutchley from English Heritage said the remains were found after he analysed photographs taken during the survey. These trenches are definitely a tribute to those male and also some females that were caught up in this disastrous conflict. The trenches themselves revealed what appears to be the extensive and unrecorded unrecorded, yes, because between 1916 and 1985, the Ordnance Survey did not record Ministry of Defence works across our land, and these trenches actually fell from the grid, preparing them for war. The systems we use is often to ignore. Back in the day, wish to forget. Lots of the landscape itself has been LiDAR surveyed as well, so you can get a good bit of a plan. I think the next thing I want to do in this video log is go to an easier, more gentler area of British archaeology, and to try and do this in a way that we can just flow. It's the pillbox. I bet anyone watching this is thinking, let's not watch a video about pillboxes. But we are, just briefly and short. Now, pillboxes themselves are relics of the past, that there's a whole society established to them. The Pillbox Society of Britain, which believes that pillboxes themselves are marks of a military landscape that are equally as important as a Roman structure or a castle, simply because they tell us a story. There were 18,000 of them at one point. This is a pillbox that's now been washed into the sea at the Isle of Sheppey. Lots of these were constructed without the metal framework that you would see with normal cast concrete. They were just shutter frame concrete structures. Lots of them are just slipping into the sea. But you not only just see them along the coast, you see them inland as well. Pillboxes are not a mark of indicating the defence against waterborne invasion. It was feared that we needed to defend open fields from parachute attack, to send messages to say that the Germans have actually just landed. The pillbox is a command post to look out across the landscape to observe, but any heavy attack would need to be done from other military placements. Just a single hand grenade would kill all the home guard elements inside this pillbox. It was just a spot, parachute landing, let's get the troops out there. It's observation. One thing that I clearly do know, this is St. Martin's Battery in Dover. They're all given different types, different numbers. This one itself is a type 23. Going over to this type 23 as well. This is in Norfolk, inland and along the coast. Lots of these pillboxes themselves, hexagonal pillboxes, circular pillbox, there's square pillboxes, all different shapes and forms. One thing, lots of them were disguised, and there's an interesting piece at the end of this. Lots of them were relatively disguised really, really well. And there's also the moment that they actually developed the idea of using different mixes, concretes, aggregates in them. And this would be very important in a Cold War to build shelters against nuclear attack. This is a circular example, the Norken box, and you can see that on the roof there's an aggregate mix. It said that if a bomb's dropped nearby and a shrapnel tries to pierce the hood of this pillbox, it would be absorbed by all the aggregate on the roof. Lots of these types of pillbox with this aggregate was established along the River Thames. The very unusual shape and form of pillbox. One piece I want to share with you is a very interesting piece indeed. I found this one on the internet, and it's simply a survey group that is working in a very coastal locality, and this illustration shows on the Suffolk coast a structure that existed well before anyone ever thought of the pillbox. It's a church dating from the 1300s, from a very unknown order of monks. And the monks built this chapel here in the middle of nowhere at Suffolk, and the whole point is that when this chapel was deserted, probably by about the 1540s, fell into ruin. And when they were thinking of the idea of constructing pillboxes, they wished to disguise a lot of them. And this is well hidden within this chapel that would have seen a completely different use 600 years earlier. But you can imagine there's a submarine commander going down the coast looking for pillboxes. It's very unlikely he would have spotted this one. Disguise of these pillboxes is essential. Lots of them reusing farm buildings. Lots of them are built as farm buildings, using lots of ruins, Roman and medieval sites, just to disguise them. And this final image here is of a pillbox that was used, cantilever pillbox at Southend Airport, to actually defend the airport against airborne attack. We couldn't do a lecture about military works across our country without adding just one final point. We've talked about structures, we talked about trenches. What about the remains of the thousands and thousands of aircraft that were downed and accidentally crashed in the Second World War? And I thought I would throw this in here actually. Now, one fascinating thing is that many military aircrafts that crashed in the Second World War are still being found, some by complete accident. The Luftwaffe is coming over with 1,000 planes. Not all of the positions of their crashes were marked, and the same can be said for our pilots as well. One or two of our pilots that went down, we don't know where they went down. Communication was lost. It was at night. Plane crashes into the ground, isolated area. Pilot was never found. But some of these remains are being found today. And across Scotland, upland areas of Wales. This is in North Guernsey, Consreen in Scotland. You can see you've got big chunks of aircraft. Not only do we have aircraft going down in mountainsides, it's part of nautical archaeology now as well. This is a Dornier 17 from the Goodwin Sands. Crash sites themselves. This is a crash site, not from the Second World War, but 1958. This crash site itself shows you where all little bits can spread out over the landscape. More recent crash sites are being found, but back to the Second World War. Bits of aircraft littering our landscape, and in fact it's a memorial. Leaving those artefacts there is very important for other generations to understand the tragedy that was the Second World War. And full circle, archaeologists carrying out an excavation for a Spitfire in a very boggy fenland locality. And also I can remember Time Team did a wonderful episode on aircraft crashing as well. This is Karl-James Langford. This is video log on the military, some of the military archaeology of our landscape. Please subscribe. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and many thanks. Have a good night.